I'll be reading the Matthew account of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the latter part of Matthew 26 all the way to the end of Matthew 28, and I'm going to be reading from the J.B. Phillips paraphrase. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus with the question, "Where do you want us to make our preparation for you to eat the Passover?" "Go into the city," Jesus replied, "to a certain man there and say to him, 'The Master says, my time is near. I'm going to keep the Passover with my disciples in your house.'" The disciples did as Jesus had instructed them and prepared the Passover. Then late in the evening, he took his place at table with the 12, and during the meal he said, "I tell you plainly that one of you is going to betray me." They were deeply distressed at this, and each began to say to him in turn, "Surely, Lord, I'm not the one." And his answer was, "A man who has dipped his hand into the dish with me is the man who will betray me. It is true that the Son of Man will follow the road foretold by the Scriptures, but alas for the man through whom he is betrayed. It would be better for that man if he had never been born." And Judas, who actually betrayed him, said, "Master, surely I'm not the one." "You have said it," replied Jesus. In the middle of the meal, Jesus took a loaf, and after blessing it, he broke it into pieces and gave it to the disciples. "Take and eat this," he said. "It is my body." Then he took a cup. After thanking God, he gave it to them with the words, "Drink this, all of you, for it is my blood, the blood of the new agreement, shed to set many free from their sins. I tell you, I will drink no more wine until I drink it afresh with you in my Father's kingdom." Then they sang a hymn together and went out to the Mount of Olives. There Jesus said to them, "Tonight every one of you will lose faith in me. For the Scripture says, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the fold shall be scattered abroad. But after I am raised, I shall go before you into Galilee." At this Peter exclaimed, "Even if everyone should lose his faith in you, I never will." "I tell you, Peter," replied Jesus, "that tonight before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. "Even if it means dying with you, I will never disown you," said Peter. And all the disciples made the same protest. Then Jesus came with the disciples to a place called Gethsemane and said to them, "Sit down here while I go over there and pray." Then he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be in terrible pain and agony of mind. "My heart is breaking with a death-like grief," he told them. "Stay here and keep watch with me." Then he walked on a little way and fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet it must not be what I want, but what you want." Then he came back to the disciples and found them fast asleep. He spoke to Peter, "Couldn't you 3 keep watch with me for a single hour? Watch and pray, all of you, that you may not have to face temptation. Your spirit is willing, but the human nature is weak." Then he went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to pass from me without my drinking it, then your will must be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for they could not keep their eyes open. So he left them and went away again and prayed for the 3rd time, using the same words as before. Then he came back to his disciples and spoke to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your ease? In a moment you will see the Son of Man betrayed into the hands of evil men. Wake up, let us be going. Look, here comes my betrayer." And while the words were still on his lips, Judas, one of the 12, appeared with a great crowd armed with swords and staves sent by the chief priests and Jewish elders. The traitor himself had given them a sign, "The one I kiss will be the one, get him." Without any hesitation, he walked up to Jesus. "Greetings, Master," he cried, and kissed him affectionately. "Judas, my friend," replied Jesus, "why are you here?" Then the others came up, seized hold of Jesus, and helped him. Suddenly, one of Jesus' disciples drew his sword, slashed at the high priest's servant, and cut off his ear. At this, Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its proper place. All those who take the sword die by the sword. Do you imagine that I could not appeal to my Father, and he would at once send more than 12 legions of angels to defend me? But then how could the scriptures be fulfilled which say that all this must take place?" And then Jesus spoke to the crowds around him. "So you've come out with your swords and staves to capture me like a bandit, have you? Day after day I was sat teaching in the temple. You never laid a finger on me. But all this is happening as the prophet said it would." And at this point, all the disciples deserted him and made their escape. The men who had seized Peter took him off to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and elders were assembled. Peter followed them at a distance, right up to the high priest's courtyard. Then he went inside and sat down with the servants and waited to see the end. Meanwhile, the chief priests and the whole council did all they could to find false evidence against Jesus to get him condemned to death. They failed completely, even after a number of perjurers came forward. In the end, 2 men stood up and said, "This man said, 'I can pull down the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" And then the high priest rose to his feet and addressed Jesus. "Have you no answer? What about the evidence of these men against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I command you by the living God to tell us on your oath if you are Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it. Yes, and I tell you that in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." At this, the high priest tore his robes and cried, "That was blasphemy. Where is the need for further witnesses? Look, you've heard the blasphemy. What's your verdict now?" And they replied, "He deserves to die." Then they spat in his face and knocked him about, and some were slapping him, crying, "Prophesy, you Christ! Who was that who hit you?" At this time, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a maidservant came up to him and said, "Weren't you too with Jesus, the man from Galilee?" But he denied it before them all, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." Then when he had gone out into the porch, another maid caught sight of him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I don't know the man." A few minutes later, those who were standing about came up to Peter and said to him, "You certainly are one of them. It's obvious from your accent." But then he began to curse and swear, "I tell you, I don't know the man." Immediately the cock crew, and the words of Jesus came back into Peter's mind. "Before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. When the morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people met in council to decide how they could get Jesus executed. Then they marched him off with his hands tied and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was overcome with remorse. He returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and elders with the words, "I've done wrong. I've betrayed an innocent man to death." "And what is that to us?" they replied. "That's your affair." And Judas flung down the silver in the temple, left and went away and hanged himself. But the chief priests picked up the money and said, "It is not right to put this into the temple treasury, for it is the price of a man's life." So after a further consideration, they purchased with it the potter's field to be a burial ground for foreigners, which is why it's called the field of blood. And so the words of Jeremiah the prophet came true. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was pierced, whom certain of the children of Israel did price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord appointed me. Meanwhile, Jesus stood in front of the governor, who asked him, "Well, are you the king of the Jews?" "That's what you are saying," replied Jesus. But while the chief priests and elders were making their accusations, he made no reply at all. So Pilate said to him, "Can you not hear the evidence they're bringing against you?" But to the governor's amazement, Jesus did not answer a single one of his accusations. Now it was the custom at festival time for the governor to release any one prisoner whom the people chose. And it happened that at this time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they were assembled, Pilate said to them, "Which one do you want me to set free? Barabbas or Jesus, called Christ?" For he knew very well that the latter had been handed over him through sheer malice. And indeed, while he was actually sitting at the bench, his wife sent a message to him, "Don't have anything to do with that good man. I had terrible dreams about him last night." But the chief priests and elders persuaded the mob to ask for Barabbas and demand Jesus' execution. Then the governor asked them directly, "Which of these two are you asking me to release?" "Barabbas," they cried. "Then what am I to do with Jesus, who's called Christ?" asked Pilate. "Have him crucified," they all cried. At this Pilate said, "Why? What is his crime?" But their voices rose to a roar, "Have him crucified." When Pilate realized that nothing more could be done, but that there would soon be a riot, he took a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I take no responsibility for the death of this man. You must see to that yourselves." To this the whole crowd replied, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Whereupon Pilate released Barabbas for them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed over for crucifixion. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's palace and collected the whole guard around him. There they stripped him and put a scarlet cloak upon him. They twisted some thorn twigs into a crown and put it on his head, and put a stick into his right hand. Then they bowed low before him and jeered at him with the words, "Hail, your majesty, King of the Jews!" Then they spat on him, took the stick and hit him on the head with it. And when they had finished their fun, they stripped the cloak off again, put his own clothes upon him, and led him off for crucifixion. On their way out of the city, they met a man called Simon, a native of Cyrene in Africa, and they compelled him to carry Jesus' cross. Then when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means Skull Hill, they offered him a drink of wine mixed with some bitter drug, but when he had tasted it, he refused to drink. And when they had crucified him, they shared out his clothes by drawing lots. Then they sat down to keep guard over him. And over his head they put up a placard with a charge against him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now 2 bandits were crucified with Jesus at the same time, one on either side of him. The passers-by nodded their heads knowingly and called out to him in mockery, "Ha ha! You who could pull down the temple and build it up again in 3 days, why don't you save yourself? If you're the Son of God, step down from the cross." The chief priest also joined the scribes and elders in jeering at him, saying, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. If this is the King of Israel, why doesn't he come down from the cross now, and we will believe him? He trusted in God. Let God rescue him if he wants to. For he said, 'I am God's son.'" Even the bandits who were crucified with him hurled the same abuse at him. Then from midday until 3 o'clock, darkness spread over the whole countryside. And about then Jesus cried with a loud voice, my God, why did you forsake me?" Some of those who were standing there heard these words, which Jesus spoke in Aramaic, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," and said, "This man is calling for Elijah." And one of them ran off and fetched a spun, soaked it in vinegar, and put it on a stick, and held it up for him to drink. But the others said, "Let him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come and save him." But Jesus uttered one more cry and gave up his spirit. And the sanctuary curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The ground shook, rocks split, and graves were opened. A number of bodies of holy men who were asleep in death rose again. They left their graves after Jesus' resurrection and entered the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and his company, who were keeping guard over Jesus, saw the earthquake and all that was happening, they were terrified. "Indeed, this man was the Son of God," they said. There were many women at the scene watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to look after his needs. Among them were Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. When evening fell, Joseph, a wealthy man from Arimathea, who was himself a disciple of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave orders for the body to be handed over to him. So Joseph took it, wrapped it in clean linen, and placed it in his own new tomb, which had been hewn out of the rock. Then he rolled a large stone at the doorway of the tomb and went away. Mary from Magdala and the other Mary were there, sitting in front of the tomb. Next day, which was the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees went on the body to Pilate and said, "Sir, we've remembered that while this impostor was alive, he said, 'After 3 days I shall be raised again.' Will you give the order then to have the grave closely guarded until the 3rd day, so that there can be no chance of his disciples coming and stealing the body and telling people that he had been raised from the dead? We should then be faced with a worse fraud than the first one." "You have a guard," Pilate told them. "Go and make it as safe as you think necessary." And they went and made the grave secure, putting a seal on the stone and leaving it under guard. When the Sabbath was over, just as on the first day of the week was dawning, Mary from Magdala and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. At that moment there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, went forward and rolled back the stone and sat down upon it. His appearance shone like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards shook with terror at the sight of him and collapsed like dead men. But the angel spoke to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has been raised, just as he said. Come and look at the place where he was lying. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has been raised from the dead, and that he goes before you into Galilee. You will see him there. Now I've told you my message." Then the women went away quickly from the tomb, their hearts filled with awe and great joy, and ran to give the news to his disciples. But quite suddenly Jesus stood before them in their path and said, "Peace be with you." And they went forward to meet him, and clasping his feet, worshipped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go off now into Galilee, and they shall see me there." And while they were on their way, some of the sentries went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. Then they joined the elders and, after consultation, gave the soldiers a considerable sum of money and told them, Your story must be that his disciples came after dark and stole him away while you were asleep. If by any chance this reaches the governor's ears, we will put it right with him and see that you do not suffer for it." So they took the money and obeyed their instructions. The story was spread and is current among the Jews to this day. But the 11 went to the hillside in Galilee where Jesus had arranged to meet them. And when they had seen him, they worshiped him, though some of them were doubtful. But Jesus came and spoke these words to them: "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. You then are to go and make disciples of all the nations and baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the world."